You were never the owner of this house. Just someone living in it. Ashley said it so calmly, like she was commenting on the weather, like 38 years of my life could be reduced to a temporary arrangement, and for a moment, I thought I had misheard her, that perhaps grief had dulled my hearing the same way it had dulled everything else since my husband passed. But when I looked across the dining table, at the polished oak surface I had spent decades maintaining, at the plates I had set with care just an hour earlier, I saw no hesitation in her expression, no softness, no trace of the woman I once believed had become part of my family, and beside her, my son Daniel didn't correct her, didn't even look surprised. He simply lowered his eyes to his glass of water as if what she had said was already understood between them, as if I was the only one who had somehow missed the conversation that decided my place in this home, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything she could have added. It stretched across the room, filling the spaces where laughter used to live, settling into the corners of a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar to me. I kept my hands folded in my lap, steady still, because I had always believed that dignity was not something you performed when things were easy, but something you held on to when everything else began to slip away, and I wasn't about to let them see me unravel at a dinner table I had once filled with warmth. "I'm not sure I understand," I said, my voice even almost gentle, the same tone I had used when Daniel was a child and came to me with problems he couldn't explain. But Ashley didn't smile, didn't soften. She leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing her legs with a kind of quiet certainty. "The paperwork was finalized last month," she said. "Daniel and I thought it would be best to move forward now." Paperwork, the word echoed in my mind, cold and distant, like it belonged in a room I had never been invited into. I glanced at Daniel then, waiting, giving him the space to step in, to say something, anything that might suggest this was a misunderstanding. But he only nodded once, a small, almost apologetic motion that carried none of the weight it should have. "It's just practical, Mom," he murmured, still not meeting my eyes. "Practical." I repeated the word silently, tasting it the way you might test something unfamiliar. And it didn't fit, not with the years I had spent building this life, not with the memories woven into every wall, every doorway, every quiet morning I had stood in that kitchen making breakfast for a family I believed would always be mine. I felt something shift inside me then. Not a break, not yet, but a slow, deliberate realignment, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place after years of being slightly off. I pushed my chair back gently, the legs gliding across the hardwood floor with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and I stood, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my sweater. "I see," I said, and I meant it, not because I agreed with them, but because for the first time I was beginning to understand something I had refused to see before. I walked out of the dining room without another word, leaving the plates, the half-finished meal, the life I had set out so carefully, and as I climbed the stairs, each step measured, controlled, I could feel their eyes on my back, waiting for a reaction that never came. Inside my bedroom, the air felt still, untouched, as if it hadn't yet caught up to the change that had just taken place downstairs. I closed the door quietly behind me and crossed the room to the old wooden dresser. My husband had insisted we keep even when we could afford something newer, something more modern. I opened the top drawer and reached toward the small metal box tucked neatly beneath folded scarves, my fingers brushing against its cool surface, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a single steady breath, because whatever they believed they had taken from me, whatever story they had already written about my place in this family, they had made one critical mistake. They assumed I had nothing left to hold on to. And that was the one thing I knew for certain was not true. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the small metal box resting in my hands, heavier than it should have been, as if it carried more than just paper and ink inside it. The house around me had gone quiet again, but it was not the same kind of quiet I had known for years. This one felt deliberate, like something had shifted beneath the surface and settled into place. I could hear faint movement downstairs, the soft clink of dishes being cleared, Ashley's voice low and controlled, Daniel responding in short, careful sentences, the kind he used when he did not want to engage too deeply, and I realized then that nothing about tonight had been sudden for them. This was not an impulsive decision, not something said in the heat of the moment. It had been planned, discussed, finalized, and I had simply been informed, like a guest overstaying her welcome. I placed the box on my lap and opened it slowly, the hinges creaking in a familiar way. Inside were documents I had not looked at in years, not because they were unimportant, but because I had trusted that they did not need to be questioned. My husband had always handled these things with quiet precision, and when he passed, I had chosen to believe that what we built together would remain intact without my constant attention. I lifted the top envelope, recognizing his handwriting immediately, steady and deliberate, the way it had always been, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice again, calm, reassuring, telling me that everything was taken care of, that I would never have to worry. I unfolded the paper, carefully, smoothing it against my knee, my eyes scanning lines that once felt distant but now seemed urgent, necessary. The legal language was dense, but I had read enough over the years to understand the essentials, and as the meaning settled in, I felt that same shift inside me deepen, not panic, not fear, but clarity, the kind that comes when confusion finally gives way to something solid, something undeniable. Downstairs, a chair scraped lightly against the floor, followed by footsteps, and I imagined them moving through the space as if it already belonged entirely to them, as if my presence had already been erased from it. I closed the document and placed it back into the envelope, my movements slow, deliberate, because there was no need to rush, not anymore. I stood and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the front yard. The same yard where Daniel had once learned to ride his bicycle, where I had stood with my husband on warm summer evenings, talking about nothing and everything at the same time. It looked unchanged, steady, grounded, unlike the uncertainty that had crept into every corner of the house behind me. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the dresser, placing the metal box carefully inside the drawer, not hiding it, just returning it to where it belonged, because now I understood that what mattered was not whether they believed I had something left, but whether I knew it, and I did. I walked to the door and paused, my hand resting lightly on the handle, listening to the muted voices below, and for the first time since dinner, I allowed myself to consider what they expected from me next: tears, arguments, pleas. Something that would confirm their assumption that I had been reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, because I had spent too many years building a life to let it be defined by a single moment of dismissal. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the light from the staircase casting soft shadows along the walls, and as I began to walk down, each step measured, steady, I felt something settle into place inside me, not anger, not even resentment, but a quiet, unwavering resolve, the kind that does not announce itself, does not demand attention, but simply exists, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I did not look at them immediately. I moved toward the kitchen sink, turning on the faucet and rinsing a glass that had been left behind, the ordinary motion grounding me, reminding me that control does not always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly when to say nothing at all. And as I set the glass aside and dried my hands, I finally turned, meeting Ashley's gaze without hesitation, and in that brief moment, I saw something flicker in her expression, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, the smallest crack in the certainty she had carried into that dinner. And I knew then that whatever they believed had ended tonight had only just begun. I did not sleep that night, not because I was restless in the way people expect grief or shock to feel, but because my mind had shifted into a state of quiet observation, as if I were watching my own life from a slight distance and finally noticing details I had ignored for too long. The house was still in motion around me even after midnight, the faint sound of footsteps upstairs, the occasional closing of a door, the soft glow of a television coming from the living room where Ashley and Daniel had remained longer than necessary, pretending, I suspected, that nothing unusual had happened, but I no longer saw their actions as isolated moments. I saw them as patterns, deliberate and coordinated. And that realization changed everything about the way I listened to the silence. The next morning arrived with a pale gray light filtering through the kitchen windows, and I was already awake, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee I had not yet touched. I watched as Daniel entered. First, his movements slower than usual, his eyes avoiding mine until the last possible moment. Ashley followed behind him, perfectly composed, her hair already styled, her posture unchanged from the night before, as if she had not delivered a statement that altered the structure of my entire life. They sat at the table without speaking, and for a few seconds, none of us moved beyond the simple act of existing in the same space. Finally Daniel cleared his throat, a small hesitant sound, and said that they had appointments later in the day, something about paperwork that needed to be finalized. His voice was careful, rehearsed, and I understood immediately that this was not a conversation, it was a notification. Ashley slid a folder across the table toward me, not aggressively, not gently, just efficiently, the way someone places an object where it is meant to be received without discussion. I opened it slowly, not because I was uncertain but because I wanted to feel the weight of each page as I turned it. The documents outlined changes that had already been made, financial transfers, adjustments in ownership, decisions that had been completed without my presence or consent. I did not interrupt, I did not ask questions, I simply read. And in the quiet that followed, I noticed something important. They were watching me, waiting for a reaction that would confirm their assumptions, waiting for frustration, confusion, or collapse. But I had learned something the night before that changed the way I responded to everything in front of me. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back on the table, then took a sip of my coffee, allowing the silence to stretch longer than they were comfortable with. Ashley shifted slightly in her chair, her fingers tapping once against the surface before stopping. Daniel finally looked at me, really looked at me, as if searching for something familiar that he could no longer locate. "We are just trying to make things simpler," he said, but the words sounded thin even to him, and I could hear the effort it took to maintain them. Simpler, I repeated internally, because it was always interesting how people used that word when they meant something else entirely. I set my cup down and stood, walking to the sink without urgency, turning on the water and rinsing the cup as though the conversation had already concluded. When I turned back, I noticed Ashley had not moved. Her eyes followed me carefully, as if recalibrating her understanding of me. In real time, Daniel broke first, reaching for the folder and closing it as though that action alone could complete the process they had begun. "We have to go," he said, not unkindly but firmly, and I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without resistance. They stood together, collected their things, and moved toward the door, and for the first time since everything had begun to shift, I observed them not as my family, but as participants in a decision that had already been made without my approval. When the door closed behind them, the house did not feel emptier, it felt clearer, as if noise had finally been removed from a space that had been cluttered for too long. I returned to the kitchen table, not to sit but to look at it, to study the surface where years of conversations, meals, and assumptions had taken place, and I realized something I had been avoiding. They were not reacting to me, they were reacting to something they believed I no longer possessed: control, memory, authority, or relevance, but they had miscalculated one essential detail. I had not lost anything yet, I had only stopped speaking, and silence, I was beginning to understand, was not the same as absence. It was preparation, and as I stood there alone in the quiet morning light, I allowed myself to consider, for the first time without hesitation, that everything happening around me was not an ending, but the beginning of something they had not yet recognized. I remained standing in the kitchen long after the morning light had fully filled the room, the silence no longer feeling empty but structured, almost intentional, as if the house itself had begun to reflect the way I was now thinking, differently, more carefully. And as I looked around at the familiar cabinets, the worn edges of the table, the small scratches on the counter that marked years of ordinary life, I started to notice something I had ignored for too long. Nothing in this house had changed suddenly, but everything had changed gradually, in ways so subtle that I had mistaken adjustment for harmony. I walked slowly through the hallway, my hand brushing lightly against the wall as I moved, and each step brought back fragments of memory I had never questioned before, moments that now felt like pieces of a larger pattern I had been too trusting to assemble. I paused at the living room where family photographs lined the shelf, smiling faces captured in what once felt like certainty: Daniel at his college graduation, Ashley standing beside him during holiday gatherings, birthdays, dinners, all carefully preserved moments that now seemed slightly different in tone. Not wrong, but reinterpreted, and I realized how often I had been positioned at the edge of those memories, never excluded outright, but rarely centered, always just slightly outside the frame. I sat down slowly on the sofa, my hands folded in my lap, and allowed myself to think back further, to the years immediately after my husband passed, when grief had made everything feel fragile but also simpler, because I had believed then that family naturally stayed close in times of loss, that shared history was enough to maintain connection. I remembered how Daniel had taken over small responsibilities at first, helping with bills, suggesting adjustments, speaking with a confidence that I had mistaken for support. And I remembered Ashley gradually becoming more involved in decisions that once would have been discussed with me, not in obvious ways, but through conversations that happened without my presence, explanations that arrived already finalized, choices that were presented as solutions rather than options. I had accepted these shifts because they were framed as help, and I had told myself that stepping back was part of trusting my son, part of allowing him to grow into his role within the family structure. But now, sitting in that quiet room, I began to see how easily trust could be transformed into displacement without a single moment of confrontation. I stood again and walked toward the window, looking out at the driveway where their cars had left earlier that morning. And I thought about how quickly presence could become optional in the minds of others when boundaries were slowly redrawn. I returned to the table where the folder still rested, untouched since they had left it, and I opened it again, not with hesitation. This time, but with focus, reading each line not as a participant in the life it described, but as someone observing the structure of decisions made without her. And with each page, the sense of clarity deepened, not emotional clarity but structural clarity, the kind that reveals how systems are built, how roles are assigned, how assumptions are quietly reinforced until they become reality. I realized then that I had not been removed in a single act. I had been gradually repositioned through a series of small, reasonable steps that each seemed acceptable on their own. I closed the folder and placed it back on the table. And for the first time, I understood that the question was not what they had done, but how long they had been preparing for it, and more importantly, how long I had allowed preparation to go unnoticed. I rose slowly and went to the kitchen, not because I needed anything, but because routine still anchored thought. And as I filled a glass of water and watched it settle, I recognized something unfamiliar but steady forming inside me. Not anger, not resistance, but awareness sharpened by removal of illusion, and I understood that what came next would not be defined by what I had lost, but by what I now clearly saw had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. I noticed it first in the smallest details, the kind of details most people would dismiss as coincidence, but I had begun to understand that coincidence was often just a word people used when they had not yet connected enough points. It started with the phone calls that came later that afternoon, short and efficient conversations I overheard from the hallway, Daniel speaking in a lower voice than usual, repeating phrases like final confirmation and processing timeline, words that did not belong in family discussions but belonged instead in systems, procedures, decisions already set in motion. I did not interrupt. I did not ask what was being confirmed, because I had learned something important over the past few days. Answers given too early often hide more than they reveal. Instead, I moved through the house as if nothing had changed, preparing a simple lunch, washing dishes that were already clean, maintaining the rhythm of someone who is not supposed to be aware of anything beneath the surface, and yet awareness had become impossible to turn off. It followed me into every room, into every silence, into every glance that lingered a second too long. That evening, while Daniel and Ashley were both out, I received a call from a name I had not heard in years, a man who had once worked closely with my husband, someone who had handled legal matters quietly, without drama or attention. His voice was cautious at first, as if unsure whether he should be speaking to me at all, but when I confirmed my identity, he paused, then said he had been trying to reach me for several weeks. I listened without interrupting as he explained that certain adjustments in documentation had been flagged recently, adjustments that did not align with the original intent recorded years ago. And as he spoke, I felt something inside me settle even further, not into fear, but into recognition, because pieces I had been holding separately were beginning to connect. I asked him one simple question: whether there had ever been a point where my name was removed from any foundational ownership records. There was another pause, longer this time, and when he answered, he did so carefully, explaining that while updates had been submitted, they were not consistent with original protections that should have remained in place. And in that moment I understood that what I had been experiencing at home was not only emotional distance, but structural repositioning. I thanked him and ended the call without emotion, then sat in the same chair I had been sitting in for years, looking at a house that now felt like it had two versions, the one I had lived in, and the one that was being rewritten without my awareness. When Daniel returned later that night, I did not mention the call. I simply observed him as he placed his keys on the counter, as he loosened his tie, as he moved through a routine that no longer included asking me how my day had been. Ashley arrived shortly after, and the two of them spoke briefly in the hallway, their voices low, controlled, precise, and I realized they were no longer trying to hide decisions from me. They were simply acting as if those decisions no longer required my presence. I stood in the kitchen listening to the sound of their footsteps moving upstairs, and for the first time I did not feel confusion, I felt confirmation. Because what had once seemed like emotional distance had now revealed itself as something far more deliberate, and as I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the darkened room, I understood clearly that what I had been watching unfold was not the loss of a family in a single moment, but the quiet construction of a reality in which I had already been written out. and the only thing left unclear was how long they believed I would remain unaware of it. I stopped waiting for clarity from them because clarity was no longer something they were offering. It was something I had to reconstruct on my own, piece by piece, from fragments they had already left behind. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not from restlessness, but from a sense of structure forming in my mind, the kind of structure that replaces emotional confusion with quiet calculation. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table without turning on any lights, watching the first faint gray of daylight slowly fill the room, and I thought about how many times I had mistaken familiarity for security, how many decisions I had accepted simply because they were presented within the comfort of family language, words like help, support, adjustment and practicality, all of which now felt like layers covering something more intentional underneath. Later that morning, Ashley entered the kitchen first, her presence as controlled as ever. She paused briefly when she saw me already awake, as if that detail did not fit her expectation of my behavior. Daniel followed shortly after, carrying a folder again, but this time he did not immediately place it on the table. Instead he held it at his side, waiting, observing, as though measuring whether I would resist before the conversation even began. I looked at both of them and realized something important. They were no longer trying to persuade me. They were confirming my compliance. Ashley spoke first, her tone polite but firm, explaining that certain administrative steps needed to be completed that week, that timing was important, that delays would create complications they preferred to avoid. Daniel added little, only reinforcing her words with small nods and brief confirmations, and I listened without interruption, not because I agreed, but because I was finally hearing the language of process rather than emotion. When she finished speaking, she placed the folder on the table, this time without hesitation, and I opened it slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to understand the exact shape of what they believed was already settled. Inside were documents that reflected decisions made in stages, each one appearing reasonable when isolated, but together forming something far more definitive. I turned each page with steady hands, noticing not just what had been changed, but how carefully each change had been justified, as if anticipating scrutiny from anyone except me. Daniel watched me closely, his expression tightening slightly as I continued reading longer than expected. Ashley, however, remained still, her confidence intact, but I could sense the subtle shift in her attention, the way she recalibrated when silence extended beyond comfort. I closed the folder after finishing and placed it exactly where it had been, then looked at both of them without speaking. The room felt different in that moment, not because anything had physically changed, but because perception had. I now understood that what they called completion was not finality, it was transition, and transition always required time. That evening, after they had left the house again, I went to the small study where my husband had kept his personal records, a room I had not entered fully since his passing. I opened drawers slowly, not searching in panic, but in sequence, following memory rather than impulse, and there I found what I was not supposed to question: earlier drafts, older agreements, notes written in his handwriting that referenced protections and intentions that were never meant to be casually altered. I read them once, then again, allowing the meaning to settle without interruption, because this was not discovery in the emotional sense, it was confirmation in the structural sense, and once confirmed, it could not be dismissed. I sat in that room long after sunset, surrounded by silence that now felt different from before, no longer empty but aligned, as if every detail I had overlooked was finally holding its correct position. And in that stillness, I understood that what they had been constructing was not just a change in living arrangements, but a redefinition of authority. And I also understood something else equally important: they had been moving quickly because they believed I was not paying attention, and that belief, more than anything else, was the first point of vulnerability they had revealed. I did not act immediately, because action without timing is simply emotion disguised as control, and I had learned by now that emotion was exactly what they expected from me. Instead, I began to move differently inside the same spaces they believed they understood. The next morning I greeted Daniel and Ashley with the same calm presence they had grown used to over the years. I prepared breakfast as usual. I asked simple questions about their schedules. I listened without interruption, and I made sure nothing in my voice revealed that anything had changed. But internally I was no longer participating in their version of reality. I was observing it, measuring it, and more importantly, mapping where it was weakest. Daniel seemed relieved by my silence, interpreting it as acceptance. Ashley, however, studied me more carefully, her attention lingering a second longer than necessary when I spoke or paused. as if she was searching for resistance that was no longer being offered in the way she expected. Later that day I returned to the study and began organizing everything I had found the night before. Not as scattered memories, but as structured evidence. I placed documents in chronological order, I compared signatures, I reviewed changes line by line, and slowly a pattern emerged that confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Nothing had been taken in a single moment, everything had been layered through gradual revisions, each one small enough to appear reasonable in isolation, but together forming a complete shift in authority. That evening I received a message from the attorney who had spoken to me previously. He agreed to meet in person the following day, not at the house, but at a quiet office on the edge of town, a place where conversations could remain private and uninterrupted. I agreed without hesitation, and for the first time in days, I felt the structure of a plan forming with clarity, not rushed, not reactive but deliberate. The next afternoon I told Daniel and Ashley that I had errands to run, nothing specific, nothing that would invite questions, and I left the house in complete normalcy. The drive to the office was quiet, the roads familiar, yet my attention was no longer on distance or direction, but on sequence, on timing, on what needed to be established before any confrontation could take place. When I arrived, the attorney was already waiting, his expression careful but not uncertain. He invited me to sit and placed a set of updated documents in front of me, explaining that he had reviewed everything again after our last conversation. What he confirmed was not a surprise, but it was a confirmation I needed. The original protections were still valid. The structure my husband had intended had never been fully removed, only obscured through successive modifications that relied on trust and lack of immediate review. As he spoke, I realized something essential: my position had not been eliminated. It had been temporarily overshadowed by assumptions made in my absence, and assumptions, unlike legal structures, could be corrected. I left the office with copies of everything I needed, not with urgency but with precision. When I returned home later that evening, Daniel and Ashley were in the living room discussing something softly. Stopping when I entered, I placed my bag down and joined them briefly, answering questions they asked about my day with complete normalcy. And for the first time I noticed a change in their dynamic, not confidence but acceleration. They were moving faster now, finalizing something they believed was nearing completion, and that acceleration told me more than their words ever could, because people only rush when they believe time is on their side, and I now understood exactly how mistaken that belief was becoming. I went to bed that night with the documents secured in the same place my husband had once kept his records, not hidden but protected, and as I lay in silence I no longer thought about loss or displacement. I thought about structure, timing, and the exact moment when perception would finally no longer match reality for them. I woke before sunrise again, not from anxiety, but from a sense of structure so clear it no longer allowed confusion to settle in. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt like silence that belonged to me. It felt like silence between events, a pause in something already in motion. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights, watching the faint morning glow return to the edges of the room, and I understood something that had been slowly forming over the past days. They were not improvising anymore. Everything they were doing had a direction, a conclusion they believed was already secured. Daniel and Ashley came downstairs later than usual, both dressed as if the day already had appointments attached to it. Ashley placed her phone on the counter and checked it repeatedly. Daniel moved through the kitchen with less hesitation than before, but also with less awareness of me, as if I had already been mentally categorized as resolved. They spoke in short exchanges about timing, schedules and confirmations, words that no longer included me as a participant, only as a condition being managed. I listened without interruption, because interruption creates resistance, and resistance creates visibility, and visibility would have disrupted what I now needed to observe. After they left the house for the morning, I waited exactly 20 minutes before making my own preparations, not hurried, not delayed, simply aligned with intention. I placed the documents I had gathered into a single folder and secured them in my bag, then drove toward the office of the attorney, the same quiet place on the edge of town where nothing felt like it was being performed for an audience. He was already prepared when I arrived, and without unnecessary greeting, he guided me through the final verification of what had been reconstructed over the past days, each page now aligned in a way that made the entire structure visible at once, not fragmented, not ambiguous, but complete in a way that revealed how much had been assumed in my absence. When I asked him what would happen if nothing was challenged, he paused before answering, explaining that inaction often allows the most recent interpretation to stand simply because it is the last one presented, not because it is the most valid, and that answer stayed with me longer than anything else he said because it clarified what I had already begun to understand. Authority does not disappear when it is ignored, it only becomes misrepresented when it is not defended. I left the office with copies of everything securely stored, not as preparation for confrontation, but as confirmation of position, and on the drive back I noticed something different in how I experienced distance. The roads felt unchanged, but my perception of them was no longer passive, it was structured, measured, aware of entry points and transitions. When I arrived home, Daniel and Ashley were already there, their presence more focused than before, as if the day had reached a point of final alignment. Ashley was standing near the living room window, her attention fixed outside, while Daniel reviewed something on his tablet, both of them briefly pausing when I entered, but only long enough to acknowledge presence, not meaning. I set my bag down carefully and joined them, asking simple questions about their day, receiving simple answers in return. But beneath those exchanges, I could sense the acceleration I had noticed before had increased, not in urgency but in certainty. They believed they were approaching completion, and that belief shaped everything about their tone, their timing, their restraint. I observed them closely as they spoke, noting how they no longer checked for my reaction, only for my compliance, as if my role had already been finalized in their internal narrative. After a few minutes, I excused myself and walked upstairs, not to withdraw, but to observe from a position they no longer monitored. I entered the study and placed the folder on the desk, opening it one last time, not to review, but to confirm alignment between what I held and what I understood. And in that quiet room I realized something essential. They were not preparing to take something from me, they were preparing to formalize what they believed had already been taken. And that distinction mattered more than anything else because it meant their confidence was based on assumption, not completion, and assumption, unlike structure, could still fail when confronted with reality that had not yet been revealed. I did not feel the need to announce anything the next morning because announcements are for people who are still negotiating their position, and I was no longer negotiating anything. I woke early again before anyone else in the house, and for the first time in days I did not feel like I was reacting to their actions. I felt like I was moving independently of them, as if the structure of the situation had finally aligned in a way that allowed me to operate without distraction. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and watched the house as it slowly came alive. Daniel came down first, scrolling through his phone, his attention already elsewhere. Ashley followed shortly after, perfectly composed as always, both of them speaking in short, efficient exchanges about timing and arrangements for the day. And I noticed something subtle but important. They were no longer trying to influence me, they were preparing around me, as if my participation had already been categorized as irrelevant. I responded to nothing in particular, only acknowledging basic conversation, maintaining the same calm tone I had been using for days, because consistency was now more useful than reaction. After they left the house, I remained seated for a while longer, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to confirm something I had already begun to understand. Patterns become visible only when you stop interrupting them. When the house became quiet again, I stood and retrieved the folder from the study, placing it on the kitchen table with deliberate care. I did not open it immediately because I no longer needed confirmation, I needed timing. I looked around the room and thought about how many years I had accepted decisions framed as convenience, adjustments framed as assistance, and changes framed as necessity, all without questioning the structure underneath them. And now that structure was visible in a way that could not be ignored. Later that morning, Ashley returned alone, which was unusual. She entered with the same controlled posture, but there was a slight difference in her pace, a small increase in urgency that she could not fully conceal. She placed her bag on the counter and looked at me for a moment longer than usual, as if expecting resistance or interruption, but I did not provide either. She spoke briefly about finalizing something later that day, her words carefully chosen, but I could hear the assumption underneath them, that everything required for completion was already in place. Daniel arrived shortly after, and together they reviewed something on the dining table, speaking in lower tones, occasionally referencing documents I was not asked to examine. I observed without comment because observation was now more informative than participation, and I realized something important in that moment. They were no longer building a plan, they believed the plan had already succeeded. The afternoon passed quietly, and I excused myself without explanation. Moving upstairs to the study where everything had begun to take shape and clarity, I placed the documents in alignment one final time, Not because they needed adjustment, but because I needed to see the full structure as a complete system, and when I did, everything became simple in a way that required no emotional interpretation, only recognition of sequence. When I returned downstairs, they were both preparing to leave again. Ashley paused briefly, glancing at me as if confirming that I remained within expected parameters. Daniel offered a short goodbye without looking directly at me, and then they left together. The sound of the door closing behind them was quiet, but final in a way that no longer felt personal. I remained standing in the entryway for several seconds, not moving, not reacting, only understanding that what they believed had concluded was still in progress, just not on their timeline anymore. And for the first time I did not feel displaced, I felt positioned, because clarity had replaced assumption, and structure had replaced expectation, and everything that followed would no longer depend on what they thought had already been decided, but on what they had failed to fully see.